Hey there. Welcome once again to another episode of Strange Planet. Thanks for always, as always, for sticking me in your ear. And if you'd like to get a little deeper into Strange Planet, consider becoming a premium subscriber. The link is right there in the episode notes. It's strangeplanet.supportingcast.fm, strangeplanet.supportingcast.fm. You gain access to commercial-free listening, bonus episodes, subscription to my monthly newsletter, Inner Sanctum, and more. strangeplanet.supportingcast.fm. On this episode, my guest is known as a bit of a document geek who has researched and published a number of collections of CIA, FBI, and military documents. He's researched and written extensively on Cold War history and national security subjects. He's written widely acclaimed books on the assassinations of President John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., and other political figures. Lately, he's turned his attention to the whole UAP, or unidentified aerial phenomenon arena. And we're going to touch on several of those topics over the next 45 minutes. Larry Hancock brings his formal training in history and cultural anthropology to his research and writing on Cold War history and national security subjects. He's a graduate of the University of New Mexico, earned his BA with honors, majoring in history, cultural anthropology, and education. Following service in the United States Air Force, Larry pursued a career in technical education, computer communications, and technical marketing. He then returned to his long-term interest in historical research. Again, known as a document geek, he researched and published several collections of CIA, FBI, military documents prior to beginning his writing efforts. His document work led to his becoming a board member of the Mary Farrell Foundation, a major online interactive history archive. With a dozen books in print, his works include an exploration of long-term patterns in covert action and deniable warfare, and also the political assassinations of the 1960s. His most recent book is Tipping Point: The Conspiracy That Murdered President John Kennedy. Other books include Someone Would Have Talked: The Assassination of President John F. Kennedy and the Conspiracy to Mislead History. In Denial: Secret Wars with Airstrikes and Tanks. Killing King: Racial Terrorists, James Earl Ray, and the Plot to Assassinate Martin Luther King Jr. Unidentified: The National Intelligence Problem of UFOs. Nexus: The CIA and Political Assassination, Shadow Warfare, and Creating Chaos. Whew. Larry Hancock, that's quite a resume. Welcome to Strange Planet. How are you, sir?
I'm fine. After that, it seems like I should take a deep breath, though.
Yeah, put up your feet, for crying out loud, and relax. Let me ask you, covering political assassinations and then moving into and covering, the sort of the national security state and so forth, and then writing about UFOs. Is that a natural progression? So, like, if you start digging into the assassination of JFK and others, is that sort of naturally leading you to the UFO issue?
I think it is if you have a document focus. As you mentioned, I've had that from the beginning. So once you start into the practice of finding how to access documents, what you can get, what you can't, how to use the National Archives, it does tend to lead you from one area, quite frankly, of classified study to another, and you kind of get hooked on what can I really get to get me behind the scenes. So from that standpoint, it does. And that led me, all the way down the line from one topic to the other, just seeing what I could really dig out and bring together. It gets to be an investigative challenge.
Right. How maybe frustrating, or how much did the President Kennedy Assassination Records Act, that kind of I guess was kickstarted by Oliver Stone's movie JFK, how has that made your life easier in terms of researching JFK's assassination, and also talk to me about some of the frustrations, because the the government has not really adhered to that in the strictest sense of the law.
It did initially, certainly. I think one of the major differences there was that legislation actually created a presidential commission, and it was a standalone presidential commission. It wasn't like the Warren Commission that had been appointed by a president. It wasn't like a a congressional commission that has a lot of politics. It really appointed a body of people and tasked them with going to get information, uh, which is very different. You don't find that much. And that group put on some experienced staff. Uh, Quite frankly, earlier commissions were a lot of political assignments, but the ARRB, Assassinations Records Review Board, put on some staff people that really knew what they were doing and knew where to look. And that has made a world of difference. The insight we have into the Kennedy assassination that we have following that legislation in the ARB is a world different. In fact, you really can't read anything about the Kennedy assassination that was written before those documents were revealed and get this picture that we get now. That's one of the reasons we're hoping that the legislation that's now in the Senate that would create a similar commission on UAPs has the potential of doing the same thing. That sort of thing can be truly groundbreaking. So yes, it had a major impact.
All of the individuals that well, there are still a few uh, um, people, I guess, still around in their 90s and Secret Service agents and so forth. But primarily, everyone who would have been involved in the assassination is long gone. Why continue to hold on to some of those documents? They say for national security, they can't be protecting individuals at this point. What is the holdup?
They can't. I think, and there are two things that they're really holding on to, and frankly, we have by now gotten most of them. I'm actually the Mary Farrell Foundation is engaged in a lawsuit at the moment, trying to shake out some of the remaining documents, but we have most of them. And what we found that what was protected in most cases were things like social security numbers, personnel data, names of people that were really sources that were important at one time that aren't now. And a lot of those, it's not that the document was it was redacted. We couldn't see it. Now that's really important to us historically, because now that we can see the names, we can go back into earlier documents and see who's saying what. And that gets to be really helpful. But I would say the other thing that's been withheld and is still being withheld are a few documents that would be very embarrassing to agencies, not so much in terms of the assassination per se, but for example, to show that they had some knowledge of Lee Harvey Oswald, that they were doing some propaganda activities or some political action activities using Oswald's identity, some things that they would not, they wouldn't have want to come out in 1964, because that raises a lot of embarrassing questions. And frankly, they still don't want to come out because that raises the question of why weren't you transparent in the first place? So to answer your question, I think a lot of it in terms of what was really seriously withheld had to do with agency embarrassment more than anything else.
How about agency involvement? Tucker Carlson has, said the quiet part out loud. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. now talking the quiet part out loud. What about agency involvement?
I think we now know, and one of the documents that was actually, or three or four released by the ARB, for example, show us now, and this is something the CIA would never admitted and didn't share with the Warren Commission or anyone. In fact, senior CIA officers actually committed perjury on the point that the CIA had investigated itself. It had investigated its own officers, especially its own anti-Castro program officers, the Cuban exiles they were working with. It had actually conducted investigation of its own people because it was suspicious of what might have gone on, whether you call them rogue operatives or unsanctioned, whatever. We now know that investigation was conducted and a report was written. The report never made it into the National Archives. It's disappeared. So you can't know what you can't know, but what we do know for sure is they actually suspected their own people, which amazingly, when you look back, the first people that RFK suspected and asked about in regard to his brother's death on the afternoon of the assassination, or the CIA and certain set of Cuban exiles that he was aware of. So to answer your question, we that has what the details have not been revealed. The suspicions are certainly now clear.
Um, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Seems quite certain about the CIA's involvement in his uncle's death. Um, is he wrong?
Well, the strange part is no one, and I still can't fathom this after decades, no one ever asked his father why the first telephone calls he made and the first visits he made pointed towards the CIA. What, you know, I don't know that he shared that with anybody, but it's just I certainly won't say that he's wrong. I will certainly say that would have been kind of like the leading indicator. If you had started looking at what Robert Kennedy thought, what was first thoughts, what were his first suspicions, they absolutely were about the CIA. So, in that respect, I certainly can't say that the concept is wrong.
Much has been made about a number of executive orders from John F. Kennedy. One, of course, made in October of '63, just before his murder, to withdraw the first contingent of U.S. military forces from Vietnam, which would have been the first step towards total disengagement. On a scale of 1 to 10, how much did that executive order contribute to his murder?
I'm kind of out of sync with most people in regard to that. Honestly, I would probably rate it down at 3 or 4 in terms of what were troubling the people that I suspect and write about were involved in the assassination. What I feel was much more significant is, and this gets hardly talked about at all, is the fact that JFK was about to start a covert back channel dialogue with Fidel Castro that the intention was actually to get Russia out of Cuba, take Cuba neutral, and clear away the embargo and reestablish some kind of normal relationships. And that was actually at Fidel Castro's initiative. It was at his initiative. The first meetings were to start in November. As a matter of fact, the first contact, impersonal contact, was to start on November 22nd. And I feel that the exposure and the significance of RFK solving the Cuba problem before the upcoming elections and essentially, resolving the problem for the United States, but essentially leaving the CIA officers and the Cuban exiles, essentially who had been working against Castro for 3-4 years, in limbo, at odds. I've interviewed some of them. I've listened to some of their remarks, and it's sort of like, they would have felt everything they'd gone through would have been a waste. When you compare to the significance of what may well have happened in Vietnam, I just see that as higher on the priority in terms of stimulating immediate action.
So those people with the company that he didn't totally tick off with his actions over the Bay of Pigs, we're now totally on side, perhaps, with removing this president after this came out, that he was developing back channels with Fidel Castro.
After the Bay of Pigs fiasco, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when all those same people assumed it was done, that the U.S. would be invading, when that didn't happen, this is strike three. Okay, he is, the talk literally was, and we have recordings, and the talk really was that JFK was a traitor. That was their attitude, and they said it quite openly.
I've talked to a number of JFK assassination researchers over the years, and many of them talk about JFK walking into like a lamb walking into the lion's den, this national security state that existed, and he just didn't have a chance. I mean, to what extent does that national security state, that apparatus, sort of exist and perhaps also explain the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr., Bobby Kennedy?
I think what he walked into was the fact that JFK didn't. He was suspicious of the fact that he really wasn't totally in command. He could give an order, and that wasn't what happened. And he saw that happen over and over again. So from that perspective, you know, that still exists. That disconnect at levels between what the commander in chief orders and what happens down in the field still exists. And I have seen over and over again, even documents from field offices or whatever, kind of saying, well, the administration is unhappy with this, or the president is unhappy with this. And some local guy says, well, then we're just going to stop reporting it. Okay, all right. Does that still exist? Does that kind of autonomy still exist? Yeah, absolutely. Now, can you map that to the other political assassinations of the 60s directly? I do see, honestly, and I've written about both of them, as you notice, I do see some conspiracies in play in both of the others, MLK and RFK. I don't necessarily see the same conspiracy. What I do see is the same disconnect. And what I also see is, quite frankly, the government is never able to investigate its own failures, if you will. Just like with 9/11, just like down the road, if something goes bad, if somebody makes a mistake, if somebody says something nobody is aware of, you can't investigate it tops down. It just doesn't happen because everybody starts doing CYA from the bottom up. So that's not a definitive answer to your question, but that part of it is still in play, and is one of my strongest objections to the fact that we think that the government is ever able to come up with 100% answers to any of these things. It just doesn't work that way.
As I'm recording this is September the 12th. Yesterday was the 22nd anniversary of 9/11. And remembering the day before 9/11 on September 10th, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld talking about the $2.3 trillion that was missing from the Pentagon. And some have made the connection that, of course, that particular area of the Pentagon that was struck on 9/11 and a particular office space in Building 7, those two areas were coincidentally involved in an audit of the Pentagon. I don't know if that's true, but Rumsfeld in that speech talking about that 2.3 trillion missing money, which still hasn't been accounted for, and who knows what the figure is now, talked about how the Pentagon bureaucracy may be one of the greatest threats to American democracy. Never mind, I think he called them aging despots overseas. He talked about this Pentagon bureaucracy, and I don't know if that's the same thing as the deep state or permanent Washington, but what are your thoughts on that?
The fascinating thing about that to me is that the system actually has a solution built into it, and that's the inspector general structure in every service, in every agency. There are good people, because the system assumes people are going to cheat, right? I mean, you have to. That's the way business works. That's the way life works. That's built into the system. And if you look at 9/11, for example, or if you look at Afghanistan, you look at virtually any of these. The thing that struck me, not just about what he was talking about there, but like after the fact on 9/11, and I wrote about that in a book, Surprise Attack, virtually every IG at every federal agency investigated and found out that the senior people had made not just little mistakes, made huge mistakes in what they did that day, what they did. All the IGs recommended that people be fired, people be terminated. Even the 9/11 Commission recommended that the head of NORAD be disciplined. In no case did the president stand behind any single IG. So I get, again, not it. The thing that troubles me most is the system has a way to deal with that. But if the presidents don't stand behind, and the heads of the departments don't stand behind their IGs, it never gets fixed. And I think that's one of the reasons we have a perennial problem at the Pentagon. I mean, I happen to be a bit of a military geek. If you look at the cost overruns, if you look at the contracting, there is not there's virtually no contracting we've done for military hardware, from refueling aircraft to littoral combat ships, that has not been a fiasco, and nobody's lost their job. And people in the military even complain about that. Why doesn't anybody ever lose their job over these things? So how can you take it seriously?
Yeah. Why does a
Anyway,
toilet seat cost $100,000?
did nobody look at that invoice? What? Okay, but yeah, that is a constant. I hate to say it.
Oh,
That's one of the things after looking at decades of this. It's never changing.
I'm sure ancient Rome was built on graft, and this is part of, you're a cultural anthropologist. This is part of the human condition. But they seem to have perfected this art in 20th century and 21st century America. What about this idea, though, that these missing trillions are being diverted, and this will lead us into obviously a discussion of secret space programs or development of advanced aircraft, which may account for the UAP phenomenon or the UAP issue. The idea that trillions of dollars are being diverted into these unaccountable black op programs.
I think that there's absolutely no doubt that money goes into black programs, where they're operational programs or actual physical things that are being built. But I guess my initial reaction is we've got a couple of illustrations about how that works recently that I think are good illustrations. About not quite a decade ago now, in the UAP space, a senator who's very much into UAPs, maybe not so much from the hard perspective as some of the experiential things, some of the basically fringe science things, actually got a large chunk of money allocated. Okay, not trillions of dollars, but okay, it's hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars. What happens to that money? Okay, it got allocated in a congressional bill, which Congress signs off on all those dollars. It got routed to an agency who had no interest in it. Okay, the people running the agency weren't. It's not part of their day job. UAPs are not. They're worried about the Chinese. They're worried about the Russians. What do I do with this money? They ended up actually shuttling it off to consultants, and contractors. And did it get buried in a way? Yes, it got buried. Nobody would have seen it unless somebody had written an investigative article about a particular UAP case that it led to. I guess my cut is I think that happens routinely. And I'm more inclined to think that, how can I say this? That it's the money tends to get either realigned and essentially spent on things that nobody reports because they don't care about them and they're not part of their major task, or in effect, it gets skimmed. I'd like to think different. I don't really think the money goes into major programs that produce something. I see no evidence of that. And one of the reasons I say that is if you look at the technology that we were seeing with UFOs, when we call them UFOs or flying saucers, when you look at that technology and what those devices could do back in 1947, they do the same thing now in 2023. When you look at the aircraft that were encountering and engaging those devices back in 1950, they were operating at the same speeds, you know, uh, Mach 1, later maybe close to Mach 2, as the interceptors that we have now that are engaging Tic Tacs and UAPs, what, 6 decades later? So if we were putting the money into something real, it's not showing up. And you might have thought, well, okay, I can expect that they could hide that for a year or 5 years or 10 years. Now they've hidden it for 60 or 70 years. And no, I don't think there's anything really there. We have better camera systems, we have better imaging, we have better computers on those aircraft, but those aircraft are performing just as in respect to the UAPs, about the same as they were 60, 70 years ago.
In other words, if there is a UFO crash retrieval program and a back engineering program, they really aren't very good at it. They haven't figured anything out.
I'm a pragmatist. I think that's an excellent summation. Yes.
Larry, we'll take a quick time out, come back and discuss further. Stay with us. Hi there. If you want to watch the rest of these episodes, please head over to my Rumble channel, Richard Syrett's Strange Planet. You can watch complete episodes there. New, complete, unedited episodes drop every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Again, the Rumble channel is Richard Syrett's Strange Planet. In the meantime, I want to thank you for supporting this YouTube channel all of these years. However, the problem is I never know when I'm going to run afoul of the censors at YouTube. I never know when I'm going to end up in YouTube jail. There doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason. And in fact, 2 more strikes and this YouTube channel will be taken down altogether. So help me fight big tech censorship, enjoy the complete unedited episodes, and join the rest of the Strange Planet community over on Rumble. Again, Richard Syrett's Strange Planet on rumble.com. See you over there. And we are back with Larry Hancock, the author of Tipping Point, The Conspiracy That Murdered President John Kennedy. Someone would have talked the assassination of President John F. Kennedy and the conspiracy to mislead history, in denial, secret wars and airstrikes and tanks, killing King, unidentified, the national intelligence problem of UFOs. So what do you make? Okay, so we're sort of discounting the recent testimony of this whistleblower who claimed that for decades, the United States government has a secret UFO recovery program. They're back engineering. They have the bodies of the pilots of these crafts somewhere on dry ice somewhere. And you're totally discounting that? Just off.
Okay, 2-part answer. He is literally, so far, looking at his statements, he is basically relating stories in regard to the crashes and the retrievals and the reverse engineering that I could show you in this bookshelf behind me that go back 30, 40 years. We had an Air Force general named Corso who told us exactly the same stories. He'd seen alien bodies. He'd gotten all the technology and from the crashes and fed it into the industrial system. That's been investigated intensely for one reason, because a lot of us wanted to see that. It's sort of like, okay, this guy finally showed up. Let's go find this stuff. And everything from fiber optics on to the solid state circuitry, we know where that came from. We know how it came about. that part really doesn't play. Okay, now let's step back for a minute. So there's nothing really new there. But the other part of his story is there are parts of his story that deal with UAPs and their interaction with uh, weapon systems, missiles, the atomic warfare complex.
Yeah.
I certainly wouldn't discount that, since I've just been involved in the last several years in a study looking at exactly that sort of thing in terms of the atomic warfare complex. What I can say is we should finally have an answer to this, because what he essentially said is he has had a number of people come to him with absolute proof that the government has, you know, pushed technology into industry, crash and retrieval parts into industry. That's a hard claim. Now, that claim was made in that project that I just mentioned a little bit ago, from a few years back.
A
And
tip.
when it was investigated, what was found was that what were turned over were samples of crashes, quite frankly, that the UAP community had known about and done testing on before. It wasn't anything new to us. But let's give it the benefit of the doubt. What's come out in just the last week or so is AARO, which is the government congressional chartered body assigned to investigate this, has posted a truly sensational document on their website. And that document literally says that Congress has given them the authority to waive any classification at any level, any confidentiality at any level, that anybody that's handled this materials, that's even if they're in private industry, anybody is allowed to, is no longer bound by any of the restrictions or classifications that they thought they were bound by. They're totally free to bring this forward, to offer this, put this evidence, bring it to the committee. They're up to now, and you saw that in the recent congressional hearings, the obstruction has already been, well, I can't talk about it because you don't have the same classification I do. That's blown away, which actually blows my mind, because I have never, in all the document work, I've never seen a document that says, okay, it's gone. There are no more restrictions. If you want to talk, talk. So that may change the playing field. I hope it does change the playing field. But I didn't want to get that out. But I do want to say that I'm not discounting all aspects of UAP interactions, especially in the military domain.
Right, right. Well, you mentioned ARROW, anomalous resolution office or something to that effect.
Right.
My understanding is that they recently, not subpoenaed, but I don't believe they have subpoena power, but they interviewed people like Robert Hastings and Robert Saleh, who have been talking about UFO incursions over nuclear sites like Malmstrom in 1967, Minot Air Force Base, or a nuclear base and so forth, talking about nuclear ICBMs being taken offline and so forth. So that's going to be very interesting to see. I mean, obviously, if these accounts are true, this is a national security issue. It's one of the biggest national security issues. If you have UFOs interfering with nuclear missiles and defense systems and so forth, any thoughts on where do you think that might be headed in terms of that particular line of investigation?
Yeah, I think that is very interesting, because, again, it's only been in the last couple of weeks that AARO has actually posted some material on their new website that talks about how interested they are in the history, which is obviously where I come from and where my team comes from. And I think that will be very revealing, because it's pretty clear that in everything that's been written about UAPs over the last few years, as a result of the Navy pilot encounters and some of these new aerial encounters with UAPs, it's all been contemporary. You would think that the subject had not existed before about, I don't know, 2014 or something like that. It's like, oh, these things just showed up. Well, actually, there are far more sensational incidents that are very well documented, from the 1950s and the 1960s. And I think, and with, interestingly enough, with technical documentation, I think it's interesting that the Aero spokesman, and statements have been made that, if we just had collections data that showed us truly anomalous flight characteristics, we'd have something real. It's kind of like, okay, yeah, it's there. We had it back then. You guys may want to go get it. One of the things I love is there's a series of reports from an Army base back in the late 40s. And the Army was so, this Army base happened to be guarding one of the first nuclear stockpiles that the U.S. had down in Texas. Nobody even knew it at the time. Okay, it was so secret. But so the Army's all upset. The Air Force is not saying anything about anything. And the Army keeps going to the FBI and to the Air Force and saying, we have dozens of reports. These things are coming at night. They're coming right down to the ground. They're coming during the day. And nobody's, so that they actually assigned these teams of artillery observers to do triangulated observations, calculate how fast these things are going. They gather up all this data and shuffle it up to Wright-Patterson to Blue Book. And Blue Book just kind of like, ho hum, it's the Army, who cares? Well, I think once ARO actually got their hands on that, when you look at the calculations, it's amazing. Some of the Air Force Base incidents that were investigated, like Malmstrom, where you actually have radar image tapes of how quickly the objects moved on both aircraft radar and ground radar at the same time. As I say, the strange thing is that some of the evidence that they seem to be dying to collect now has been sitting around for decades, and we know about it, and it's been well documented and written about. And fortunately, even researchers managed to save all those original Blue Book files from microfiche documents and that. So ARO has a wealth of information that is available to them, and that's actually what we have been using in our studies of UAPs in the atomic warfare complex. So if they need help, we can tell them where it is.
Larry Hancock, we'll take another time out. Back with more in a moment. What would it feel like to reclaim your health, your vitality, to sleep deeply, to live fully, to address health at the root, at the cellular level, so that your body can detect damage where you have it? Imagine living younger, longer, having the energy to do what you want to do when you want to do it. Discomfort fading away. ASEA Redox Supplement harnesses the power of your body to heal itself, giving you the ability to power your potential. This is one of the most profound health, athletic, and anti-aging discoveries of our lifetime, and we need the world to know about it. If you want to learn more about ASEA, visit strangeplanet.teamasea.com, strangeplanet.teamasea.com, and be sure to text or call my colleague and friend Lynn at 443-254-6024. Hi there. If you want to watch the rest of these episodes, please head over to my Rumble channel, Richard Syrett's Strange Planet. You can watch complete episodes there. New, complete, unedited episodes drop every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Again, the Rumble channel is Richard Syrett's Strange Planet. In the meantime, I want to thank you for supporting this YouTube channel all of these years. However, the problem is I never know when I'm going to run afoul of the censors at YouTube. I never know when I'm going to end up in YouTube jail. There doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason. And in fact, 2 more strikes and this YouTube channel will be taken down altogether. So help me fight big tech censorship, enjoy the complete unedited episodes, and join the rest of the Strange Planet community over on Rumble. Again, Richard Syrett's Strange Planet on rumble.com. See you over there. Larry Hancock is with us, one of the top investigative researchers in the areas of intelligence and national security. He has written extensively about political assassinations, the Cold War, and the author of Killing King, America's Secret Jihad, Shadow Warfare, the History of America's Undeclared Wars, The Awful Grace of God. The website is larry-hancock.com, larry-hancock.com. That's in the episode notes as well. Just click on that. I just want to spend a few minutes because you have researched and talked a lot about the Cold War and conflicts around the world and so forth. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the current conflict in Ukraine, and where do you think that is headed? Here we are. Well, it's going to be 2 years in February, so a year and whatever it is, 8 months. What are your general observations about where that conflict is headed in terms of its eventual outcome?
Sure, I was fortunate in that respect. I got interested in that and actually wrote a book back. Oh, I guess it's about 5, 6 years ago now, called "Creating Chaos." It was on political warfare, and I really focused on Putin and what contemporary Russia was doing in the way of political warfare at that time, and how it had evolved, because it was a fascinating evolution from a country that had actually been a fairly pure democracy at one point in time, after the turn of the century, and had gone totally the other direction, had revived all of the political warfare that it had been conducting under the Soviet Union. And you could get a you could at that point in time, it wasn't that obvious, but one of the things that was obvious, and I have to say, is if anyone had ever actually listened to what Mr. Putin says in public, he's always told the truth. He's always said exactly what he was going to do, exactly what his agenda was. And if you just kind of written down over 2 or 3 years, there's no surprise. People treated him as if they wanted to hear what he was saying, but not listen to what he was really saying. So the point is, he started talking about what was effectively a revival of not the Soviet Union per se, but the Russian Empire, the
Yes.
Russian sphere of influence from a cultural perspective, basically claiming cultural rights for Russia over much of Eastern Europe, certainly over all of the former satellite states. And if you looked at the map of Imperial Russia, and I actually, again, it's easy to map that out. He was talking about those territories that he considered culturally part of the Russian, as I say, sphere of influence, or it's like, this is us. They are we are us. They think that they're a part. They were here during the Soviet Union, and then somebody let them go, but they need to come back. And even at that point in time, 2014, 15, 16, you began to see political action operations, computer warfare, cyber warfare, and you could see that this agenda was beginning to roll out. And the interesting thing is, you could almost follow it country by country through the former Soviet blocs of how they were moving politically. When it didn't work politically, then they moved militarily, as in Georgia. When it didn't work politically, they moved into eastern Ukraine. Essentially, the election that Ukraine had in 2014 was a local politician, Ukrainian politician, versus Putin. Putin was actually campaigning in Ukraine and on Russian television for the Russian candidate for the Ukrainian presidency. And it was absolutely certain he was going to win. One of the interesting things, it's an interesting campaign because there was all kinds of money going in from Russia, and money going in from the various so-called democracy initiatives, including from the U.S. that had started under the Bush administration and had been funded under the Bush administration, including a lot of, in any event, it was kind of like a contest.
Right.
and that laid the foundation. And when Putin didn't win, there's a real transition. For a period of time, Putin wanted to be a diplomat. He wanted to be part of the G7, the G8. He wanted to be a player, just like everybody else. He wanted to be Russia to be a player, superpower player on the tier with everybody else. When he started running into difficulties, he fell back into another mode. And so I guess my comment on what's happening in Ukraine is, in that book, I described Putin as a master tactician because of what he was doing at the time in Syria, in Africa, Central Africa, North Africa, the way he was using the Wagner Group, very tactically. Uh, it's kind of like not bipolar, but he has a diplomatic initiative and a military issue. If this sounds like the United States during the Cold War, that's because it is the
Yeah.
United States during
Yeah.
the Cold War. It's like when I looked at it, I'm going, I have seen this before. In fact, I wrote another book about this before. This time it's them, not us. Um, so you can see that playing out all the way to the point where, for whatever reason, and I don't know that anyone will ever necessarily explain it other than maybe age, frustration, he suddenly abandoned this tactical success to a strategic blunder. I mean, and I think it was because he really convinced himself, and I think most people, analysts now, he had convinced himself that Ukraine was Russia to the soul, that that Russia simply had to make it clear to express its will and kick out the foreign influence, and Ukraine would come back. One of the things we know, there was actually an article written for a Russian newspaper that was to be published the day of the invasion of Ukraine that welcomed Ukraine back into the Russian Federation. And I think that was the mindset. And he had kind of gotten himself into the mindset that, this is an illusion. As soon as we demonstrate to the Ukrainians that we're really there, they will all fall in line, and this will really be a special military operation. And what was going to be a tactical thing ended up being a strategic blunder. Okay, sorry, that was a long-winded
No,
answer to
that's it's
your
all good.
brief
It's all
question.
no, it's all important information. I guess just in conclusion, though, a tactical blunder, perhaps, but I mean, Ukraine now is practically a failed state. I mean, how many millions of people have left Ukraine? They're not coming back. Their brightest and their best are underground now. They're dead. Um, what is the future of Ukraine?
I think the future of Ukraine is, and this is okay. You're starting to see part of it. One of the things you have to keep in mind about Ukraine was always two things to Russia. It was a source of coal and industrial production in the eastern part, largely because under Stalin, that area, which is the Donbass now, was essentially resettled from Russia. That was Russian. However, the western part of the country had never been Russian. Matter of fact, historically, parts of it had even supported the Nazis during World War II because of the Stalinist programs. That part was the major supplier to Russia of, if you want to call it, technology, design, engineering. Those people are still there. Which is why you see so much really creative military weaponry and cyber weaponry and drone systems. Those people are still there. As you say, certainly there was a massive flight across the border, and as long as Russia can, pummel Ukraine, that's not going to change. But Ukraine now it's kind of showing that part is still there. And to answer your question, there is still there's still the Donbass, and there's still the rest of the Ukraine, which is culturally European leaning. Does that imply that ultimately there will have to be some sort of partition? I couldn't predict that, but I will say now there are two Ukraines, like it or not.
Right.
And how you deal with that is going to be a matter for history. But there's still a very viable Ukraine west of the Donbass.
Right. Yeah.
Uh,
But this idea that the Ukrainians are going to take back Crimea is a fantasy. Would you agree?
they can take it back. I think is they can isolate it. Take it back with ground forces is a real question. Isolating it, quite frankly, is not hard considering the fact that it is, it's connected to Russia, you know, only by a number of bridges. Now, can they? That's a very interesting tactical question. I can see that as an area that's part of a settlement.
Right.
You
Right.
know,
Because
it
the
would be
summer offensive, yeah, there was,
terribly bloody to try to take it back with manpower. However, to make it untenable to sustain militarily is not so much of a challenge.
right. Well, there was, big hopes for the summer offensive, which never really materialized. So
Yeah,
let's hope
too
that
too
there's,
many too many Russians, too many minefields, too many trenches.
yeah,
that was just unrealistic. I'm afraid.
yeah. And now the hard ground is coming. So the battle, perhaps a counteroffensive will begin. Um, Fantastic meeting you, Larry. I hope we can do this again. It was very instructive and so much more to talk about, obviously. Appreciate all of your time. Thank you.
I enjoy it. Thank you.
A new Richard Syrett's Strange Planet drops every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.
Hi there. If you want to watch the rest of these episodes, please head over to my Rumble channel, Richard Syrett's Strange Planet. You can watch complete episodes there. New, complete, unedited episodes drop every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Again, the Rumble channel is Richard Syrett's Strange Planet. In the meantime, I want to thank you for supporting this YouTube channel all of these years. However, the problem is I never know when I'm going to run afoul of the censors at YouTube. I never know when I'm going to end up in YouTube jail. There doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason. And in fact, 2 more strikes and this YouTube channel will be taken down altogether. So help me fight big tech censorship, enjoy the complete unedited episodes, and join the rest of the Strange Planet community over on Rumble. Again, Richard Syrett's Strange Planet on rumble.com. See you over there. And welcome once again to another episode of Strange Planet. And if you'd like to delve deeper into Strange Planet, check out my premium subscription program. There are 3 tiers to choose from. Choose the one that's right for you. You gain access to commercial-free listening, bonus episodes. You get a subscription to my free monthly newsletter, Inner Sanctum, discounts on Strange Planet merchandise, and more. Just go to strangeplanet.supportingcast.fm, strangeplanet.supportingcast.fm, or just click on the link in the episode notes. All right, we are rolling into Halloween. Of course, podcasts like this were made for Halloween, and we're gonna get into some haunted history of the South, from battlefields to plantations, from the Louisiana swamps to Appalachia. I say Appalachia, some say Appalachia. I'll get the proper pronunciation here in a minute, because Brandon Schexnayder is the host of the chart-topping history podcast Southern Gothic, a show that explores the dark history of the American South and sheds light on some of its most important and infamous legends, mysteries, true crime, and haunted places. Brandon was born and raised in New Orleans, Louisiana, eventually moved to Franklin, Tennessee to work in the music industry as an audio engineer. His experience in recording studios, working with some of the countries in Americana music's best storytellers, eventually drove his passion to dive deeper into good old-fashioned storytelling and trading lies, as he calls it. and we're going to talk about Civil War sites and much more right now. Let's welcome Brandon to the podcast. Brandon, how are you? Great to meet you.
I'm doing well. It's fantastic to meet you, Richard. Definitely.
So let's talk a little bit about the podcast, Southern Gothic. Give us the origin story, if you will.
The origin story. Well, as you said, I'm New Orleans born and raised, so I just grew up around all these kind of haunted stories and the vibe of the Gothic, if you will, right? But honestly, growing up, what I had is I had a couple parents who were really into genealogy down there in New Orleans, and so that meant pre-internet, you were going to cemeteries every other weekend, right? So they were dragging us through cemeteries and all, and that's kind of when I got into this field, this love of just the kind of macabre and the creepier things, and that kind of memento mori vibe, if you will, of just being interested in what ghosts are and what the stories are like and all. And later on down the line, when I started dabbling in podcasting, I knew that this was the place for me. This is the thing I was passionate about. This was the stories that I wanted to tell. Yeah.
And I always get the sense, when I see those cemeteries in Louisiana, because they're above ground because of the flooding and so forth. But I always get the sense that people feel more of a connection to their ancestors than maybe we do in other parts of the country. Is that fair to say?
I can't speak for y'all, but I know exactly where I'm going to be buried right now because we have a family tomb down there, right? And so you grow up and it's very much on the surface because you'll go visit and that's where your grandparents are, your aunts and your uncles are. These are little houses and they'll just kind of pile the whole family in, right? And so when you go to these cemeteries, a lot like going to a small town, even where you'll walk through one of those old cemeteries and you're seeing all your family names going back. But in New Orleans, because these cemeteries were once on the edge of town and we didn't have much else to grow, these cemeteries are now in the middle of the cities in the suburban areas, right? So you're just driving through and you'll see the school bus dropping kids off. And the next block there, you've got the city of the dead right next door to it. So,
wow. What does Southern Gothic mean? We hear that term a lot. Southern Gothic.
Sure.
Mean?
Yeah, well, it's kind of a play on, the term American Gothic with the painting, right? It's kind of a play on words to begin with. But, when it comes to the Gothic, I kind of look at it as that style of literature with old Dracula, with that kind of Gothic romanticism that happened, in the older world, right? In Europe. And a lot of that centered around this kind of decaying aristocracy. Right. This is what Dracula was, right? This was a rich family that owned everything and had this beautiful castle. But what we're watching is this downfall of it. And the South has a really interesting kind of turn in that way because the early Southern culture was based in aristocracy with plantations and things of that nature, right? And it was built on the same kind of oppression of people. And so today we see these plantations and in post-Civil War, we watch them kind of crumble and fall. And so folks like William Faulkner kind of bought into that and kind of followed that same tradition that you'd see in like the Mary Shelley and Bram Stoker and all. And so that's kind of the tradition I go into. I love the words. I just loved the title. I'll be honest. I just thought it was such a cool play on words with everything that I nerdily read growing up for sure.
And how do we listen to the Southern Gothic podcast?
You can find it on any of your podcast players where you're listening to this one, I'm sure. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Castbox, all the usual suspects.
You say that Southern history has been swept under the rug because of violence and racial issues. Just unpack that a little bit for us?
Sure. Well, I don't know if it's necessarily as much swept under the rug, but I think it's the kind of thing that that what the South had is a very unique time frame here. We were just speaking a few minutes ago before we went on air about the length of time that we've had in history in our towns, right? How in reality, the South, maybe some of these places are 300, 400 years old, very much in opposition to like where Mary Shelley was talking about Frankenstein, right? So a very short period of time. And in that short period of time, what we had is we had these cultures coming from all around the world, right? You had the colonists coming over from Britain. You had French people coming, and they were creating colonies with New Orleans and up in Canada, right? You had the Spanish coming in Florida, Texas. So all these different cultures were all kind of coming together right where there were folks that were already indigenous people there. And then you also factor in the African slave trade. And then this very brief period of time, we just had this conflict amongst all of these people that were all smashed together. And the result of that is something that I think even today we still kind of grapple with politically. And that might be some of the source of even within ourselves, not even the South versus the rest of the nation, of these different cultures and our backgrounds that were all kind of smashed at once.
It's like gumbo.
That's, it was on the tip of my tongue. I'm not going to lie, but I didn't want to go there. Being from New Orleans, y'all are waiting for me to say something like gumbo or lagniappe, right?
Well, or a pastiche, if you will. And so it's interesting because, as you say, all of these cultures and legends and belief systems all coming together, informing, giving rise to this incredible rich history. All of this great lore, also responsible for the great music that came out of the South, the Delta blues and all of that. It's just such fertile ground. So a great place to be if you're into storytelling. Tell us a ghost story.
Absolutely. A ghost story. So, the one I like to tell the most, it kind of centers down from where I came from, right? It's about a voodoo priestess called Julia Brown, who supposedly used to live down in the Manchac Swamp, not that far from New Orleans. And Miss Julia Brown, she was born enslaved down in New Orleans, and her husband fought in the U.S. Army during the Civil War. So it was certainly something that was a part of that conflict and that changing of history, right? But he received a land grant to go and live out in the swamp. He received 40 acres of land. There were large landowners in the Manchac Swamp in a town that was called Frenier. All right. And this is about halfway between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. You can actually drive there on the interstate today. There's a fantastic seafood restaurant there to mark the spot that a lot of folks know about. But but this town of Frenier, they moved out to the town of Frenier, and as the legend goes, that while they were there, they were in this community of German farmers, because New Orleans, as you said, we can call it a gumbo, right? It was definitely a port city. And if these port cities, if there's anywhere that you really see that gumbo of different cultures come together, it's places like New Orleans. And you can hear that in my own accent. You can probably hear little bits and pieces from being in this port town. And this community out in the swamp, it was at one point it was called Schlosser, but it was called Frenier when they got there because it was a German immigrant. So it was a lot of folks that looked a lot like me, blonde hair, blue eyes, Schlosser, Schexnayder, right? So it's a very German community. They were harvesting timber and they were raising cabbage out in the swamp. And it was such an isolated community out there that you could only get there by boat or by train. There was no car, there was no roads in and out of the community in any way, shape, or form. But Julia and her husband, they moved out there. They were considered laborers on census records. But because of her background and her supposed practicing of voodoo, she kind of became the town's healer over time, right? Because if you were sick, exactly, she was a root worker, if you will, right? The person, she would deliver babies as a midwife would. She was the person who, if you got sick and you didn't want to go all the way to New Orleans, wait for the train, you would come to Julia. And as a result, what that meant was she became a pretty important part of the community. And she lived there for many years. But in the 1915, or somewhere around 1915, early 20th century, Celestin passed away, and she's living out there in the swamp by herself on the edge of town. And the folks in town started to notice when they'd go out to visit her, something had changed about her demeanor. And they'd go out there to the edge of the swamp and they would see her on the front porch of her cabin. And she'd just be in her rocking chair, fiddling with a piece of string. And she'd sing this song to them. When I die, I'll take the whole town with me. When I die, I'll take the whole town with me. Right. Well, of course, they have no idea. This is German. This is a very Catholic, blonde hair, blue-eyed, European ancestry community. And here you have someone who practices a religion they don't understand. And they hear that. And of course, you can imagine what they think out there isolated in the swamp, right? And so over time, it just life goes on out there in Frenier. But eventually, Julia Brown passes away from natural causes. She's in her 80s at that point in time. We have census records to see how old she was. And the day she passes away, of course, they start preparations for her funeral. And 2 days, 2 days later, they have her funeral. And of course, everyone in town comes and they pack this small house at her funeral. It says standing room only, right? All these people are coming in, whether or not it's because she was such a beloved member of the community that they were just they delivered their babies. They took care of her, whether it was that or of course, maybe they were trying to appease her spirit, right? Because they were afraid of this possible curse, this warning. Well, it just so happens it was about 4 o'clock that afternoon while they're at her funeral. What they don't realize, because they're so isolated out there, that an immense hurricane is starting to make landfall down Southeast Louisiana, down in New Orleans, this immense hurricane that would have been considered about a category 3 today. And it starts making its way up the river towards Frenier. And they are quite literally at her funeral when the rains start coming down and the bands of those hurricanes, or the bands of that hurricane, starts hitting the wind shaking the walls, if you can imagine. And folks started freaking out. You can only imagine they were thinking in their brains, when I die, I'll take the whole town with me. And they're at her funeral there. So people are going and they're running. And as they leave and they have the rains are coming down, the storm surge hits about 12 feet that day. And you're out there in the swamp. So the waters are rising up over the land and everything. People are running to the train. 25 people got on the train. They tried to get out of town, only got about a quarter of a mile down the road. Folks were climbing these cypress trees that day to try and escape from drowning in the waters. But you can imagine that might have been a worse fate, because while they're up there clinging to the trees, they could hear their fellow family members and community members drowning below them in the water. So it was an absolutely vicious day that day. Between 200 and 400 people died in Louisiana as a result of this hurricane on September 29th, 1915. And to this day, folks still say that it was her, that she cursed the town, that it was Aunt Julia Brown who caused this from happening. And to back that up, we can go and we can look at all the records and follow all of that to see that all of this happened 2 days after her death. Even there was an obituary in the paper that even described her funeral to a T, as I just did, as that's when the winds were coming down. So here we are over 100 years later, and it makes us wonder, is this true, or is this some type of old Cajun superstition?
Remarkable. As she's being buried, there are hundreds of other people being literally buried alive. We'll take a quick timeout. Brandon stays with us, the host of Southern Gothic Podcast. Back with more in a moment. Hi there. If you want to watch the rest of these episodes, please head over to my Rumble channel, Richard Syrett's Strange Planet. You can watch complete episodes there. New, complete, unedited episodes drop every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Again, the Rumble channel is Richard Syrett's Strange Planet. In the meantime, I want to thank you for supporting this YouTube channel all of these years. However, the problem is I never know when I'm going to run afoul of the censors at YouTube. I never know when I'm going to end up in YouTube jail. There doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason. And in fact, 2 more strikes and this YouTube channel will be taken down altogether. So help me fight big tech censorship, enjoy the complete unedited episodes, and join the rest of the Strange Planet community over on Rumble. Again, Richard Syrett's Strange Planet on rumble.com. See you over there. And we are back with Brandon Schexnayder, host of the chart-topping history podcast, Southern Gothic, which explores the dark history of the American South. And one heck of a ghost story there about Ms. Brown. What do you think about these legends that she cursed the town? Do you have any thoughts?
Well, I've spent a lot of time researching this. I do this podcast. My sister is an archivist down at the Louisiana State Museum, and this has become one of her babies, one of her research babies. And so we have gone through and found every census record we can find on Julia, gone through every newspaper article. We've tried to trace this over the years, and honestly, I'm even more confused than if I actually had an answer, right? I mean, because what we've seen over time is that the story's kind of played a bit of like telephone with each telling, right? It's kind of altered a little bit from, as I mentioned, the obituary record mentioning that we're at a funeral to later down the line in the 70s. There was a newspaper article with a young girl who survived the hurricane down in Frenier, and she believed that Julia Brown was warning them about this hurricane back then, that she knew something was coming and she was warning them, and then we get further down the line. And this is what I see stories do all the time when they're this old, is then we start hitting the period where it starts making it on TV shows. And of course, as TV shows come on, they start kind of embellishing some as well. And ironically enough, it was a Weather Channel TV show called American Supernatural. I don't know if you've ever seen that. I think they had all of 8 episodes.
I have
It was
not.
a Weather Channel ghost show, okay, in the early 2000s, and they played her up as this vicious woman, vicious woman that was cursing it, and that of course has changed over time. So, I don't necessarily know if it's her, but one thing that I do find from these ghost stories is these are real people. Yeah, these are real
Yes.
people that lived real lives, and I think it's something, the more I dive into these stories, whether or not I believe in the supernatural aspect or not, I do believe that these people really were involved. And there's some kernel of truth, and there's something that we get out of the stories.
Any personal encounters with the supernatural?
I have not had any that were these blaring instances of my belief or my disbelief just kind of dripping away. And it's not for lack of trying at all. I go to a lot of these locations. I've spent a lot of time. I spent an evening at Waverly Hills Sanatorium, stayed all night till 6 a.m. I do a lot of those events. I'm not a ghost hunter by any way, shape, or form. I don't buy into as much the evidence type ghost hunting. I don't use the meters and the things like that. I've always kind of searched for an impact on myself. What I believe, though, is as I go to locations, when I really go to these haunted locations, when I go out to Man Shack and I go to a place where somebody like Julia Brown lived, and you stand there, I feel like there is something about being there, that an energy is there, that something's kind of left over the years. And if there's anything whatsoever that would be, to me, the kernel of that supernatural or the kernel of that paranormal, I think that's the starting point for it, for sure. So definitely have a belief in it. However, I haven't had that moment yet. I did not see a shadow person up in Kentucky at Waverly Hills, unfortunately.
I've never seen a UFO, so there you go.
Exactly. It's the one thing you want to see more than anything. And we give you guys all this PR. Come on, you know.
You mentioned, going to Waverly, and I mean, there are now pilgrimages to all of these
Oh
places,
yeah.
and there's so many, ghost hunting shows. Not so many as there were. I would say maybe like 10 years ago. I think it kind of hit its zenith, where it just like 3/4 of the TV guide were paranormal and ghost hunting type shows, UFO hunting shows, and so forth. What are your thoughts on sort of the ethics of haunted tourism?
Absolutely. Well, haunted tourism itself has been around for a lot longer, even if you think about it. But so the shows are kind of the new iteration, if you will, and I joke even with podcasts and true crime, and we talk about ethics there, how, we had murder ballads in 18th century England, right? We've had this sort of thing for centuries. So we've always had some type of appeal to go to these places. When it comes to haunted tourism, though, one of the issues we've had here in the South specifically is, we had a bed and breakfast culture that popped up in the 80s in plantations that began kind of creating new stories out of nowhere. So as I've studied ghost stories here, and I've kept myself to this one particular culture, this one particular kind of region, I've seen these different spots where if you see a stereotype or a cliche, I can almost tell you what time frame it came from because of when the culture is, right?
Hmm.
And somewhere around that late 70s, early 80s, those plantations started becoming bed and breakfasts. And all of a sudden, what we have is we have all these stories that really have no basis in reality whatsoever. And these all kind of things pop up and they're not historically accurate, right? But
I
I
don't want to
will
put you on the
say,
spot, but I don't
sure.
want to put you on the spot, but do you have an example of that?
Sure. I mean, I will call out America's most haunted home today. The Myrtles Plantation down in Baton Rouge in St. Francisville, right outside of Baton Rouge. They have a particular spirit they call Chloe. And there's this long story about Chloe, how she was an enslaved woman, and she became the owner of the plantation's mistress, if you will. He moved her into the house. Of course, at some point in time, his attention to her started to sour, right? And she was taking care of the kids. She was kind of like the nanny. And the story goes that as his attention started to turn, she started to try and grab back for attention for him. And one day she got the bright idea. She gets the idea that she's going to bake into the children's cake a little bit of oleander for one of their
Mm.
birthday. Get him a little sick, and then she's going to nurse him back to health. And of course, he's going to be so smitten by her skills that he's going to fall right back in love with her. And this is the story, right? And of course, you know what's happening next. This is absolutely a cliche story. She puts too much oleander in there. The children all die. And of course, he finds out it was her. She goes running out. She's trying to get away. The enslaved population on the plantation are scared that if they take care of her, so they actually drag her out to the levee and they hang her and they kill her, right? So to this day, and actually, I apologize. There's even a portion of the story that I left out where at some point he catches her trying to eavesdrop on her and cuts her ear off. So she wears this turban to hide that, to make her really unique as a
Ticks all the
ghost.
boxes. It's a great
You know,
story.
absolutely. So, yeah, so today, folks talk about Chloe. She might be one of the most popular the most popular ghosts on the Myrtles Plantation. Definitely say it on the tour. I've been on the tour down there. Everyone leans into this turban-wearing ghost of Chloe, but there's absolutely no historical evidence to it whatsoever. There's no evidence. The children did not all die at the same time. Two of the children did die and what we assume was likely something like yellow fever in the span of maybe about 6 months. I don't remember exactly the dates of it. And then another one actually grew to old age, grew into adulthood. So the story's a lot of inaccuracies, but this legend's persisted, right? And they've made a lot of money off this legend, and it's something people go to. And so you look at that, it gets butts in chairs, as you would say in the entertainment industry, right? It gets folks coming out, it gets folks searching for it. I will say at the same time, does this mean Myrtle's Plantation is not haunted? Not at all. I won't go there with that. I won't say that doesn't mean that a spirit doesn't exist that we believe is that. However, that story is inaccurate. That story isn't. That was 100% fabricated by the Frances Kermeen Myers, I believe was her name, and she turned the Myrtles into an Airbnb. Yeah.
Wow. I mean, on the one hand, I'm glad it's not because it's a horrible, tragic story. On the other hand, it's such a great story. I kind of wish it were true.
Well, that's the problem with a lot of them is they're incredibly good. They know exactly how to drag the story out, right? Or the story arc.
All right. When we come back, you're going to tell us another true ghost story. Brandon Schexnayder is with us, the host of Southern Gothic, the podcast. Stay with us. Hi there. If you want to watch the rest of these episodes, please head over to my Rumble channel, Richard Syrett's Strange Planet. You can watch complete episodes there. New, complete, unedited episodes drop every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Again, the Rumble channel is Richard Syrett's Strange Planet. In the meantime, I want to thank you for supporting this YouTube channel all of these years. However, the problem is I never know when I'm going to run afoul of the censors at YouTube. I never know when I'm going to end up in YouTube jail. There doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason. And in fact, 2 more strikes and this YouTube channel will be taken down altogether. So Help me fight big tech censorship. Enjoy the complete unedited episodes and join the rest of the Strange Planet community over on Rumble. Again, Richard Syrett's Strange Planet on rumble.com. See you over there. Brandon Schexnayder, host of the podcast Southern Gothic. How do we listen again, Brandon?
We are on all your favorite podcast apps, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Castbox, wherever you're listening to this show, actually.
All right. So you told us this amazing ghost story that wasn't true. Now maybe share your favorite ghost story that is true.
Favorite. Absolutely. Well, this is one recently that I went down and visited the site. So I think it's one that has a lot of facts and truth and all. Down in Atlanta, it's a place called Lake Lanier. And I know that this is a very hot topic right now. Lake Lanier has kind of become one of the ghost stories that's kind of poking out, and it's kind of evolving in some ways about it, because they say that Lake Lanier is cursed, and it's a man-made lake. It was made back in 1956. The Army Corps of Engineers, they came into Georgia, and of course they needed an aqueduct and they needed hydroelectric power for Atlanta because it was growing so much, right? And so they flooded this lake, and to this day, the lake itself is considered cursed because basically it's the deadliest lake in America. Every year you have anywhere from about 6 to a dozen people actually die on this lake. It's documented every year. It's always tragic seeing that headline. So it's had a lot of issues, and local folks have talked about it being cursed. But before it was ever considered cursed, there was this one story. There's this one ghost story out there in Lake Lanier, where they said out on this bridge out by Gainesville and Old Dawsonville Highway, there's this bridge. He said, as you drive across the bridge, people would always see this woman, a lady in blue, a blue dress, walking across the bridge at night. And I'm sure, Richard, you've heard of lady in white stories, right? Where you pick up the young woman and the classic tale of pick her up and then you get home and she's not in your back seat. Mm-hmm. Right. Well, this one's a little different.
At her house, and it's actually the cemetery.
Exactly. She wasn't ever there, right? Well, this one isn't quite like that. This one's a little scarier because as folks get closer to this lady in blue, who they started calling the lady in the lake, they realize she's in this just tattered dress and she doesn't have any hands. Okay. And for years they've talked about this woman who's at the lake there. Now, the thing is folks for a while, they believed that this woman was one of 2 women who actually drowned in the lake or disappeared in the lake. So back in April of 1958, only 2 years after the lake was made, a woman by the name of Delia Mae Parker Young and her friend Susie Roberts were driving across the bridge. It was the middle of the night. They were going down, I believe it was like a dance, if you will, at that point in time. It was 2 women. They were going out for a night on the town. Okay. And as they're driving out there, there's these old windy roads because you're on all the ridges of the old mountains. And as they go to cross the bridge, all that we know that happened to them, or there's just skid marks across the bridge, and the car's gone in the water. No sign whatsoever of where they went other than those skid marks. So, of course, everybody came out. They had search parties, everything. This was already becoming sort of an issue down at the lake. So they had folks going down into the water, scuba divers, the fire, everything. No trace of these 2 women whatsoever. About a year went by. The families had no idea what happened to the women in any way, shape, or form. I just figured, they were in the lake, right? But then a year later, a fisherman on the lake actually, as he's out there one morning, discovered one of the bodies floating there in the lake. Okay, so they pulled her up out of the lake, and of course they couldn't identify her at that point in time because there was so much going on, no idea whatsoever who she was. They buried her. After all that time, they just buried her as unknown from the lake. They assumed that she was one of these 2 women, and they just continued on continued on with a life out there. Nobody knew, but this apparition started appearing, right? And it wasn't until 30 years later, 30 years in 1990, that they were going to expand this old bridge in the Dawsonville Highway there, and they were down dredging in it, that they found the car. And they found down in the bottom, they found the car with Susie Roberts still in the car. And they were able to identify her and pull that car up. And of course, what they found is she didn't have any hands when she was in that car.
Wow.
So now this was just 1990. I mean, the grand scheme of things, in 1990, when they pulled it up, of course, this allowed them to identify the other body that they had found, and so they've since gotten burials, proper burials, if you will. But it's so chilling. And we talked about humanity earlier, because when I went out there and we went and visited the spots and kind of went around Lake Lanier, I actually went to the cemetery to see where they were buried, right? And we went out to Susie Roberts' grave. And what was chilling to me is, as we walked up to this grave, there was a small trinket there that said, "I love you, Mom." After all those years, this gentleman grew up probably hearing this story about the lady in blue, the lady in the lake, and that was his mother after all those years.
Wow. Yeah.
So,
These stories become legends and lore, and they're told over and over and over again. And we lose sight of the fact that it's attached to an actual human being who had children, or who was loved by their parents and so forth. We lose sight of that.
Absolutely. And this was definitely one of those cases. And that lake in general, there's so much lore surrounding Lake Lanier. We could go for hours about why it's cursed, and all these different things have happened there. But this lady in the lake is really, it was the initial kind of ghost story for it. It was the initial kind of humanity out there for a while. Early TV shows, when they started talking about the curse, they always talked about this lady in blue. So it's taken on a life of its own, as you said. Yeah.
I was reading about Lake Lanier before we started recording, and just I think since 1990, there have been something like 200 deaths, like boating accidents and drownings on this lake. And then also stories about arms coming up out of the lake and pulling people down and so forth.
There are so many now. We say 200. I've never seen a truly accurate number. I've seen everything go up to 600 just everything you could possibly see with the number. But I will tell you, I first started researching the story back, I believe it was 2019, 2018, when I started getting into the story. And since then, we posted, I believe it was on YouTube. We posted our podcast on YouTube. And what I noticed, unfortunately, and it makes me feel a bit guilty, but every summer we'll notice those numbers go up. And it's always attached to about 2 or 3 times that year that someone passes away in the lake. And we find out because folks come looking for this curse. Folks believe it, but it's exactly as you said. People have said that if you go out there on the lake, you'll be swimming. You might feel like there's arms pulling you under. Someone was electrocuted this summer on the lake. It's all sorts of different things. Now, there are 3 reasons why people say the lake might be cursed. Okay. So I'll put it out there. There's 3 separate ones. And for a long time, the reason was, as I mentioned, this is a man-made lake. The Army Corps of Engineers, they bought up bottom lands out in the hills out there in the mountains. Right. And this was basically poor farmers. They were buying their property. And of course, it was the federal government. They weren't exactly paying them a lot of money, right? They were just trying to scoop up that land at this point in time and do as quick of a job as they could. I think they spent about 10 years trying to acquire all the land. And again, it was poor farmers. And they say that the Army Corps of Engineers did not move the cemeteries. And of course, these were family cemeteries. These were farms, right? So you can imagine this would be, 6 generations of your family on your property or something. Some of them were moved. So if you were to go around today, you might see some spots in cemeteries with little plaques. But in general, so for the longest time, they talked about that was the curse, right? But again, as we kind of saw with the Julia Brown, with each generation, we kind of changed the story a little bit. And what we've kind of seen in the last few years is a lot more information's come out about some of the towns that were underneath the lake. And one of the supposed things, of course, one of the possible reasons for it being cursed is that the town of Oscarville was down there, and it was a primarily Black community, a farming community. And in 1912, the folks there in Forsyth County, all the white folks ran out the entire Black population of Oscarville because of a violent, essentially a young woman was raped, and they accused a young man in the Black community of doing it. And this just unfortunate, far too common story of violence in the South unfolded, where it became the Black community against the white community, and just violence escalated over the next month or two. And they literally ran out everyone from town, and something very similar to what, we all know about Black Wall Street, right? So folks have kind of latched onto that. Maybe that is a possibility of why this lake is haunted today, or cursed today. And that's one that's a common claim. And of course, we can go even further back, and we can talk about at the same time, there's also a sacred land from the Cherokee were there as well. So it's sacred indigenous lands, or some folks have tied into an environmental type curse, right? We're messing with Mother Nature, so therefore this might be the reason. So there's a lot of different angles that these things go, and Lake Lanier is kind of on the cusp of folks deciding culturally which one it might be in the next few years.
What is the most haunted location in Franklin?
Excuse me. We have a place called Cherry Manor here, and it's now an office building. And it was built back somewhere between 1820 and 1821. And it is without fail the place where, when you take one of the ghost tours or you go there, without fail, if it's a group of people, people get freaked out. It's the spot where you go on the porch, you just feel like something's wrong. And a lot of folks have went ghost hunting there, had a lot of experiences with ghosts that are physical with you. These are kind of people feeling like they're getting tripped and they're getting shoved and they're getting their hair pulled, right? But the thing is I don't really have a story as to why. And that's what makes it even scarier almost. We don't really know of anything that happened there that really would cause this in a way that would describe what people are talking about, and there's been a lot of local lore about it being at one point in time, it was a nursing home upstairs and a funeral home downstairs, right? So it was good for business and, old Southern stories, right? But a lot of that was just hooey. It was a family property for a long time. And for some reason, when it comes to paranormal activity in Franklin, that's the place people claim the most. Yeah.
And you've been on that porch? Nothing happened?
No, I mean, I've had, that porch has made a believer here or there from a couple of men who thought they were tough guys for sure. Now, I've never seen anything there. I've seen some convincing photographs and things from time to time. One of the common things is folks feel like they're being watched as they're walking by, and frequently they'll get pictures, the kind of traditional, somebody staring out at you. I've definitely seen a few. There's this one window where it seems to happen all the time. I've never gotten physically pushed or felt that pressure. But I've definitely been there when other people really get that vibe, that anxiety, that discomfort in the building. But it's I joke, it's all these high-end lawyers that have offices there. So maybe it's just them that are making people uncomfortable, right?
Ick factor. Yeah.
Exactly.
What's happening on the Southern Gothic this Halloween? What's coming up?
Sure. Yeah, well, on October 9th, we have a wonderful story that I'm really excited to share. On October 9th, we are putting out a little known story about Edgar Allan Poe. And I know that sounds crazy. He's not in the South, right? But most folks don't realize he actually joined the army when he was a teenager, joined the army and was stationed right outside of Charleston. And while he was there, of course, in Edgar Allan Poe fashion, he fell in love. And we have a ghost to talk about with that story. So I'm really excited about that one. Outside of that, we'll just be doing our traditional Halloween fun. I'll be telling a bunch of stories. The last 13 nights, we'll release a little mini episode every day for 13 days. Little campfire stories, kind of like we did today. So
you're going to be busy. Brandon Schexnayder, host of Southern Gothic. One more time, how do we listen?
You can listen on all your favorite podcast apps, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, no longer Stitcher, I guess, Castbox. And of course, we're on YouTube as well.
Fantastic. Brandon, great meeting you. Let's do this more often. And I look forward to the next time.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Richard.
Happy Halloween.
A new Richard Syrett's Strange Planet drops every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.
Hi there. If you want to watch the rest of these episodes, please head over to my Rumble channel, Richard Syrett's Strange Planet. You can watch complete episodes there. New, complete, unedited episodes drop every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Again, the Rumble channel is Richard Syrett's Strange Planet. In the meantime, I want to thank you for supporting this YouTube channel all of these years. However, the problem is I never know when I'm going to run afoul of the censors at YouTube. I never know when I'm going to end up in YouTube jail. There doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason. And in fact, 2 more strikes and this YouTube channel will be taken down altogether. So help me fight big tech censorship, enjoy the complete unedited episodes, and join the rest of the Strange Planet community over on Rumble. Again, Richard Syrett's Strange Planet on rumble.com. See you over there.